Thranki Ramatraka. I was asked here on my channel to provide some information about food, diet, nutrition. The question arose, the person who asked it had seen at least some of my video series on, it was either the video series called The Arcane Teachings or The Arcane Formulas by William Walker Atkinson. I narrated the video series. It was material written by William Walker Atkinson, and the asker about food, the person who asked about food, asked if maybe, let's say, a point of view such as William Walker Atkinson might present about food, if he were to have said anything about it, what would that be? Or anything similar to that. So that implied to me that the person who wanted this information not only wants an exoteric, let's say medical or biological or professional, let's say, or academic nutritionist point of view, but also a more esoteric or, let's say, occult explanation about food and diet. And also, the person who asked suggested that a lot of material has been reviewed by the person about the subject, but it seemed like a lot of it wasn't all that coherent. And I think I understand where that kind of question comes from. Well, for one, people in general, most people, especially, well, I'm just going to say especially in Western civilization, but perhaps in many areas of the globe, we've kind of, as we become adults, forgotten our innate tendency to know what to eat and how to eat it. We've kind of lost touch with our innate sense of hunger, actual hunger, as opposed to appetites. And what would have turned into our own developed instinct to answer this question has been lost. Additionally, there's not a lack of information about it. There's too much. There's so much, right? And maybe it's not so much that there's too much, but that it's so varied. And there's some very specific information, like eat lots of avocados. But then you come upon some other information after you've been eating all these avocados, some information that says, well, they have too much fat. Don't do that. So this stuff all gets pretty confusing, right? And we have people who develop very extreme diets because of ads on TV, or because they've read some book on health, or because they've read some, recommendation from another point of view. But there's extremism, there's confusion, there's lack of coherence in some of the descriptions. There's lack of consistency with other descriptions. So the question, if we consider the fact that we've kind of lost touch with our innate sense for this, and so we look outside for information, and it's just confusing. So what do we do? How do we know what to do? And especially if we want both some, of the more outer dietary information to be mixed in with a more esoteric view of food and the, the forces that are involved with food and the energy that is derived from it. And I'm not just referring to like the nutrients, the standard nutrients, but the more nutrients being part of the physical plane of food, you know, how it is affecting our biological organism at a very physical level, you know, like matter point of view, but also behind the scenes, you know, like more of the plane of forces, or what some people might call the energetic side. Now, I don't mean energy, again, in the physical sense, like calories. I'm talking about vital force, vital life force. The question seems to be seeking an answer that includes that as well, in a coherent fashion, sensible. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to provide, my attempt here is to provide that kind of an answer. And yes, I do have some material on this written by William Walker Atkinson. And I had thought that I had more material of the nature, and I went over to my physical library here to my right and looked for it, because that's where it was, and it's not there. So I'm going to have to kind of wing it here. The information that I was looking for is not too much different than the whole picture I'm going to present with what I do have of my own to offer, as well as what William Walker Atkinson has to offer, and just a couple other little bits of writing here that I have for you. So anyway, again, it's not that there's a lack of information. It's that it's hard to weed through and figure out what's useful among the information that's really there. I've made a couple of notes here, so occasionally I'm going to look down to try to remind myself of everything that I did want to say. So what I'm going to offer are general guidelines. And one general guideline is that general guidelines are pretty much the way to go to avoid extremism and to avoid specific recommendations for a diet. Because as soon as anybody does that, like I've already implied, somebody else is going to come along and point out what's wrong with that specific diet. So when it comes to specific food choices, you know, really, by the time we get to the end of this video, it's going to become apparent that specific food choices, as a rule, you know, a dogmatic set of specific food choices, things to eliminate, definitely, and things to definitely include, aren't as important as general guidelines and the information gathered from the more esoteric point of view. That's a general guideline right there to follow. At moments here, I'm going to have to put these reading glasses on that really don't look good on my face. They make this weird reflection. I guess you're just going to have to not look if it doesn't look very good, but just still listen, please. Yes, no extremes. That's another general guideline. No extremes in anything that I say here, whether it's coming from me or from something I'm reading. Try to avoid extremes. That's a good general guideline. You know, don't go too far off in one direction with your eating habits, except for when you follow the guidelines or the advice set out in the more esoteric side of affairs. That is something to really place a lot of attention on, because attention is part of the game when it comes to eating and how it's done. Another reason to avoid thinking in terms of extremes or being really dogmatic about something or going really far in one direction when it comes to food choices, food choices, is because a person can get themselves into some strange predicaments in life if they're following something that strictly with respect to what to eat. I mean, sometimes you don't have much choice. There are situations in life in which that can come up in which you really don't have much say over it, or where there's not much available. So if you've definitely counted something out, and then that turns out to be the only thing there is to eat, you're kind of stuck. Other circumstances can come up, like, let's say you don't eat meat. Never, 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 never. No meat, nothing. No animal products whatsoever. And you go visit somebody and they're serving meat. Maybe they have a vegetable and then meat, lots of meat. And you're hungry, and the social circumstance dictates that it's probably a pretty good idea for the social, lubricant to eat, and you don't eat meat. So what are you going to do? You're going to blow the whole atmosphere by saying, well, I'm sorry, maybe I should have called ahead and told you I don't eat meat. I'm sorry, is that okay? It's kind of not okay in some cases. So, avoiding extremism, dogmatism, real strict, hard rules, avoiding those is a good general guideline for a lot of reasons. Another one is if you get stuck eating something that you have definitely cut out of your diet. I mean, if you get stuck having to eat something that is a member of a class of foods that you have completely eliminated for quite a long time from your diet, well, it could have an adverse effect on you. Another good general guideline, of course, is to try to cut out, as much as possible, foods that contain huge gobs of impurities and things that are definitely not healthy for you. I mean, that's pretty good. That's a good idea. That's a good thing to try to cut out when it comes to food choices. I mean, try to, an extreme, absurd example of what I'm talking about is try to cut out eating foods that are rotting. That's just a bizarre, extreme example of what I mean. Or if you know that a certain restaurant is serving food that's contaminated with something. These are just bizarre examples of the kind of thing I'm trying to get at here. Just in general, try to eat foods that don't have tons of impurities in, or might have come from an area of the world where there's recently been a near meltdown in a nuclear power plant. Things like that. There's a good general guideline. I mean, some people don't think of that. Other people, they do. And if you can't tell, if you don't know, you're out shopping and you're looking at a vegetable or whatever that looks really good and you don't know its history, okay, that's fine. That's fine. But if you know that a certain food type in general contains, there's a pretty good chance that it contains impurities and your body's just kind of getting used to those impurities, well, maybe try to cut that out. I mean, why give your body a lot of extra work to have to do? You got to fight off impurities and poisons and whatever that happen to be in a certain type of food, and you know about it, well, then cut it out. Knock it off. And another good general guideline, I've already kind of implied this too. Pay attention to the esoteric side, the plane of forces, the energetic side of foods, and the spiritual aspects of what you're eating. For a variety of reasons. And some of these will become more apparent as we go. But right now I'm laying out general guidelines. In other words, not just pay attention to the nutritive aspects of food, but also the more esoteric side. And I think that, the person who asked this question wanted both of these sides. So as a general guideline, I'm saying when you eat, consider both sides. And when you pick your foods, consider both sides. But what specific foods to buy and what specific foods to eat, I'm not going to sit here and lay down a dogmatic diet for various reasons, some of which I've already named. Another general guideline is try to stay close to nature. And by this I mean, all right, let me create a scale here. All right, a scale that has two poles to it. All right, on one end would be, let's say, highly processed foods, foods that are darn near synthetically manufactured because of all the processing involved. On the other end of that scale would be completely organically grown plants. Clearly, one end of that scale is closer to nature than the other. Try, as a general rule, to stay toward the natural end. Try to stay closer to nature. It's a general principle. Right? Another one is try as much as possible within your comfort, within your range of comfort, to eat foods in their most energetic form. Usually, that means the more youthful a plant is, the more energy it has for you because of its youth, because it is growing rapidly, because there's a lot of energy going on in that plant. There's more in it for you, more bang for your buck. Now, part of food, you see, is not just the amount of nutrients and energy in it, or vital force in it, and the nutrients in it, but how well you can assimilate them, and how much of it gets assimilated. So, let's see, you can have a food item that doesn't have a high level of vitality to it, but then there's how well you can assimilate that energy. You can eat such that you assimilate all of it. And compare that with a food item that has a high level of energy involved, a lot of nutrients in it, and you don't eat it in a manner that enables you to assimilate but maybe half of it. Well, you come out about equal. But let's say you have both things in your favor. Well, then you're getting the most bang for your buck. Right here in this general guideline that I'm referring to now is the how much comes with the food item rather than how you go about it so that you assimilate all of it. Try to stay with foods that are in their most energetic form. And when it comes to plant life, excuse me, well, I guess, and animal life too, but I'm more specifically speaking of plant life here, the plant kingdom of food for us. Stick with the younger stuff because there's more energy there. And in its youngest form, well, of growth, let's say beyond the seed stage or beyond the nut or the bean, stage, when it starts to sprout, starts to grow, just right then. As soon as it's right after it has sprouted. In other words, in its sprouting form, that's when the most energy is involved. I mean, my goodness, there's so much energy involved. I mean, a little seed can split a rock in half, trying to shoot out its, shoot into the air and dig its roots down the other way. Excuse me. The growth rate is tremendous. And there's so much energy there. It can actually, I'm sure most people are aware of, and have maybe even seen photographs of a little tiny plant that has split a rock in half, because all the energy that is there, all that life force. Well, that's the kind of energy we want to get out of our food. And we not only want to have food sources, or should, perhaps if we care about this kind of thing, aim to have foods that are in that form, right? You have the most energy, but then go about how we ingest those foods in a manner that gets everything out of it that we possibly can. So, one food item that I am going to suggest, but not, I'm not recommending going crazy with it, but sprouts. All right, now everybody, I know there are two kinds of sprouts that come to mind as soon as somebody says sprouts. The two main sprouts, at least in the United States, that people will automatically think of are those ones that come in Chinese food, mung bean sprouts, and alfalfa sprouts. Well, I'll tell you this. Mung bean sprouts don't have many nutrients. They're mostly just water. It happens to be pretty clean water. So if you eat them, you're going to get cellulose, all right? Cell walls of plants, fiber. There's fiber there, yeah. And you're going to get some clean water. There's not a lot else in there. But they are sprouting. They are sprouts, and therefore there's vital force. Okay? But among all the sprouts, or across the entire, in the realm of sprouts, of all kinds of seeds, nuts, beans, mung beans they're kind of low on the nutrition scale. Now the other one was alfalfa sprouts. But come to think of it, anything that's sprouting is a sprout. There are all kinds. You can sprout anything that's sprouting. Anything that's sprouting is a sprout. Now, again, I'm not advocating turning your house living room, or your family den, or your library, or the shed out back into a sprout room. You don't have to go that far. If you want to, that's fine. And again, I'm not advocating cutting out everything except sprouts. That's extremism. I'm indicating a general guideline that the younger the plant is, the more vitality is involved with it. The more life force is there for you when you eat it, if you know how to eat it. Another thing about sprouts. Here's another thing to know. I'm going to talk about protein for a minute. We all know that our bodies need protein. And protein seems to be a big subject when it comes to diet discourse. High protein foods. Well, part of the digestive process, as you no doubt know, is the breaking down of protein into amino acids. There aren't a lot of amino acids. There's a small number of them. But protein structures, endless. And they're complex structures, and they do require considerable energy to break down. And it takes some time to break them down. But break down, they must be. They must be broken down. They are broken down into amino acids. And then our bodies construct from those amino acids the proteins that are needed at the moment. So yes, our bodies need a lot of protein, and that somehow gets translated into the idea that we need to ingest tons of protein. Really, what is the body needing? to meet its protein requirements? Amino acids. Because once again, the protein that we take in gets broken down into amino acids, which takes energy. Okay? Why not go for foods that are high in amino acids? It cuts out part of, energy consumption. It cuts out the energy consumption that is used up in breaking down protein structures, which again are large structures. They're complex structures, and it does take some work to break them down. I'm not saying we don't need protein, and I'm not saying stop eating foods that are high in protein. I'm saying consider ingesting foods that are rich in amino acids. I mean, all the body then has to do, really, amino acids are rather simple structures in comparison with proteins. Then all the body has to do is build the proteins, not break down proteins and then build proteins. When we take in protein structures, let's say meat, high protein, well, those were the proteins that the animal needed and that were in his body and going on, at the time of its death. Now we're supposed to get life out of that, involving proteins that were for that animal right then. Now, these have to be transformed into our protein needs by way of making them into amino acids and then making proteins out of the amino acids. So I think I'm trying to, I think maybe I've said enough about this now to give you the picture. If we just ingest amino acids, by no means cutting out high protein foods or anything, is just a general guideline, something to think about. And sprouts, in their beautiful, energetic simplicity, have more basic forms of nutrients, broken down forms of nutrients, than do the more mature ones. And when it comes to plants, in their youthful form, more simple structures, in general, as a general statement here, than does, excuse me, meat, no matter how young or old the animal is. Sprouts happen to be high in amino acids, but not all of them. Like I said, mung beans, there's not a lot there. Clean water and fiber. But alfalfa sprouts, radish sprouts, clover sprouts, broccoli sprouts, on and on, you name it. I mean, they don't all taste great. So people generally, there are the common ones: radish sprouts, clover sprouts, broccoli sprouts, sunflower sprouts, alfalfa sprouts. Alfalfa is probably the most common, at least in the part of the world I live in these days. But anyway, there's a lot of amino acids there. And now, here again, don't go to extremes. People who eat only sprouts are missing out on some other good stuff. And when we're eating these more simple foods, if we're cutting out a lot of other stuff, well, look, if we have a piece of meat, or meat and potatoes, all right, covering half of a large dinner plate, there's quite a bit of substance, right? But if we have a pile of alfalfa sprouts about the same size, where there's a lot of air in there's a lot of water involved. If you want to get the same nutrient quantity from sprouts, you don't just eat a handful. I mean, I kind of get irritated if I go buy a falafel sandwich somewhere, in a pita bread, and they make the sandwich, okay? It doesn't matter if you know what a falafel is. That's not the important part here. And I have a selection of stuff I want put in there with it, like lettuce or whatever. And I say, and I'd like some sprouts, right? And they've got alfalfa sprouts there. And they grab a couple and sprinkle them on. But what's that going to do? I'm trying to get my amino acids in here, And they put a little, squeeze a little bit on there. I don't know. I'm trying to find something laying around here to show you like how much they mean. Like I don't know. All right, here's a lid from a carton of something. Grab a little bit like that and sprinkle them on. I think, come on, man, I want some sprouts. You know, I mean, I can eat a couple of platefuls of these things and feel pretty good from it, especially if I know how to eat it so that I can assimilate all the vital force in it. I can feel the difference if I go about it like that. But a little sprinkle like that, I know how to eat it so that I can get all the vital force out of it. Yeah, I do. But I want more than that. That doesn't replace my steak, you know? So, the more simple the food, the more water it contains, let's put it like that. Maybe, you know, eat more of it, but know how to eat it too. Then you might not need it quite as much. But I know that some people have made mistakes. You know, they've gone on a basically sprout diet, sproutarians, right? And they don't eat much. If you if you're going to go to that extreme, all right, then here's a general guideline for that too. Eat a lot of them, and eat a variety of them. I mean, don't be chintzy with it. You know, really go at it. When I used to eat a lot of sprouts, and I was growing my own, I would fill up a huge salad bowl, and I mean a large salad bowl. Not a little thing like this, a big one. You know, the kind that you mix your salad in to serve to the family, you know, and then they can each get their own out with the tongs. I'd fill one of those with sprouts. Fill it, overflowing, and eat them. My point about sprouts there, really though, was a lot of amino acids involved. You can build your own proteins out of that without having to break down proteins that belong to some other animal. Saves you a lot of energy. Another thing about eating foods in their most energetic form, I talked about the youth of the plant. Well, similarly, a general guideline right along the same lines is eat the plant as soon as possible in a reasonably short amount of time after it's been picked. It's still alive. I mean, an extreme example of how not to go about it is you go get this nice young spinach, right? Not this old leathery stuff that doesn't have much growth potential left except to go to seed. But you get this nice young baby spinach, let's say. Okay. Whoa. Good energy involved there, right? Good energy and a lot of it. And then you let it sit in the refrigerator for a long time. Now it kind of like it was young to start with and it's still young because it was young spinach, but now it's old. After the picking. So try to keep it young in both regards. Now what else? Ah, yes. Another general guideline. On with the glasses, off with the glasses. This is, perhaps you've heard of the universal law of analogy. Correspondence among levels of things. Well, this guideline that I'm about to bring up here, that I'm about to discuss here, is analogically like the one I just talked about. You know, the youth of a plant, keeping it young. This one is just a different level of the same principle involved. If you add into your diet, again, nothing extreme, not meaning to count anything else out, just consider adding into your diet foods that are young in the food chain, at the bottom of the food chain. Now, at the bottom of the food chain is plant life. And at the bottom of the food chain are plants that have various names, like microalgae, plankton, phytoplankton. And there's a brand out for a long time now called spirulina. These kinds of things. The bottom of the food chain on the planet. Now, there are some reasons for this. A couple of which I'm not really well rehearsed in articulating, actually. But the idea is the same, just at a different level, as is the idea involved in eating plants that are closer to their sprouting stage. Apparently, as foods go up the food chain, up the food chain, at each step that it takes, there's a little something lost in it. So if you get down to the bottom of the food chain and just add something like that into your diet, you're going to get a lot of vitality, and you're going to get basic nutrients in their most fundamental forms, and a lot of them. Minerals, vitamins, and so forth, amino acids. And now, speaking of the food chain, it's often thought that man, the human being, is the top of the food chain. And I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure if a man who's being eaten by a lion is that man right then is at the top of the food chain. I'm more certain about what's at the bottom of the food chain. So, man cuts out a lot of the middle men by going to the bottom of the food chain and eating. I mean, that's on the planet as a general picture. That's where it all comes from anyway. All the nutrients. You can cut out some of the middle. But I don't mean give things up. I mean add something like that into your diet. If you want to cut something out in exchange for it, cool. Pick something that's probably not very good for you. Like cut out candy bars, add spirulina. It's a fair exchange. Probably a pretty good one. If you don't have access to such a thing, or you can't afford it, some of that stuff kind of expensive, you know. If it's not possible, don't worry about it. I mean, nothing to be afraid of here. Now, another kind of example of cutting out the middleman, just like perhaps cutting out the digestive middle stage of breaking down proteins just to get to amino acids to build your own proteins. Why not just take in some amino acids, a little more amino acids, maybe a little less protein, and cutting out some of the middle steps of the food chain. Also, eating plants instead of animals, you're cutting out. When you eat an animal, the nutrients that you're really getting in large, once everything is broken down, have come from the plant that the animal ate. Ultimately, I mean, if you are what you eat, well then so's any animal that we eat, right? And the animal, in most cases, of animals that we eat, unless we're off into some strange exotic meats, we're largely eating the flesh of animals that eat plants. And that's where the nutrients have come from in the little microcosmic picture that I'm talking about here. I mean, ultimately, they can be traced back to the bottom of the food chain. That's the whole idea of a food chain on the planet. But within the little small picture of cows grazing in the pasture, they're eating the grass, or whatever we're feeding them. plant life, okay? And then we eat that meat. If we were to go eat plants, now I'm not saying go out and eat grass, but the idea here is, you know, one kingdom versus another. Plant kingdom versus the animal kingdom. Biologically, of course, of which we're a part of, the animal kingdom, but talking about nutrients going from the plants to the animals, then to us. If we go eat just plants, then we're cutting out that middle step. It's just a general guideline. Nothing to get, you know, overly excited about, but it's another example of cutting out the middle part. When it comes to meat, well, we could just go on and on and on about that. That is a major area of controversy when it comes to food. So I want to address that a little bit. As far as I can tell from my notes here, those were the general guidelines that I have, and I want to tell you a little bit about how I came up with them. So that you know I didn't just sit down and make this stuff up today. I've studied food, diet, nutrition, and the big word, nourishment. Nourishment. I want you to include in that concept of nourishment the vital force. Not just nutrients and calories. Nourishment. Nourishment at all levels from food. The exoteric side of it and the esoteric side of it. All comes together in the word nourishment, okay? And by vital force, if you know of the term prana, I'm talking about prana from food. There's also prana from the air and other sources. Prana from water. This is a non-physical type of nourishment that we obtain through food and in other ways. But food prana is necessary for us. So the idea that all we really truly need behind the scenes is prana, and if we have true ancient wisdom in our current modern, postmodern mindset, then we don't really need food because we can get all the prana we need from the air because we're breatharians. And not a good idea. No. There's prana that we get from the air that we need, and there's prana that we get from food that we need. It's two different sources. Prana is prana, okay, but we need it from various sources because we have various levels of our being that correspond with these different sources. And I want you to just expand your idea of nourishment to include prana from food. And in this video, I'm going to talk about water too. There's prana from water as well. So, nourishment. I spent a long time in my life studying nourishment. And I have done a lot of experimenting. And I too, a long time ago, felt pretty confused because of the gamut of information. But I looked at a lot of it. I spent a long time at it. And I experimented. I grew a garden. I studied about the plants that I was planting. I studied about what they all look like at various stages of their growth. I created this garden out of my father's front yard. This is a long time ago. I built it with just some basic hand tools, a machete and a knife. That's all. I built this whole garden. I learned about companion planting. I used no herbicides or pesticides. And I knew nothing about gardening when I started. And from the moment I decided to build this garden, while there was still grass out in the yard that I hadn't mowed, it was grown up, gone to seed nearly, weeds in it, all kinds of things. I decided I don't want to mow that grass. I'm going to make a garden out of it. from the day I decided that, I stopped buying all food. Now, I had already been a pure vegetarian for several years, and I knew enough about the answer to the question, well, if you don't eat meat, what are you going to eat? Well, it was kind of like everything else. Meat was just one item to me. I mean, I just cut that out and I ate everything else. No big deal. And I felt great. I mean, with respect to the effects of what I eat, I felt better than when I ate meat. I didn't become this skinny, emaciated, weak, pale-looking little anemic thing walking around, you know. No! I was pretty healthy. I was pretty strong. I felt good. I felt clean inside. Felt great. I did it right, you know. I just stopped eating meat, that's all. And I ate more of the stuff like what I've been talking about, in the manner that I've been talking about, or to which I am alluding. And I followed these principles. And I had acquired understanding of these general guidelines by having studied all kinds of diets, from Zen macrobiotic to, I don't know, stuff I saw talked about on TV, books on healthy eating, natural living, on, you know, until I was so confused, I thought, I'm not going to pay attention to the particulars anymore. Except for a few things that seem to be standards, you know, like the common things, like try to eat young food, sprouts, and so forth. And I had also studied foods that cleanse. I had grown up near 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, and I split. I left the area in, what was it, 77, 78? When there was almost, or perhaps actually was, a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Middletown, Pennsylvania. And I was very concerned about that event. And I got out of the area and went to New York City, where I lived for 10 years. And I put in considerable energy into studying about foods that cleanse the body of radioactive particles. And I found that foods that cleanse the body of radioactive particles are foods that in general just cleanse your body. Sprouts of various types happen to be a food, you know, that does pretty good at carrying certain types of radioactive particles out of your body, along with other poisons. And there are other foods that do this as well. I was very interested in cleansing the body, not just providing it with nourishment, but cleansing it. And I didn't want to go buy products that are made for cleansing the body. I wanted to just use foods that give me, you know, substances that give me nourishment to do it. So all of these things considered, the study, the experimenting, the looking at it from various angles, some of the more energy side, prana aspects of foods, I came up with these general principles, okay? And I used them. And I experimented with their effects. And that's how I came up with these general guidelines, okay? They were the common elements among the most sensible material, verified by my own experience. Now, on to meat. And we're going to get to William Walker Atkinson. Now, the person who asked this question of me, you know, to provide some information about food and nourishment, is what it comes down to, mentioned Pythagoras. And it's interesting because I have something here that mentions Pythagoras. And it has to do with vegetarian diet. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I'm not saying run out and be a vegetarian. I wouldn't recommend stopping eating all meat if you like meat. You know, I am going to say that if you have interest in in cutting down on your ingestion of animal food, then cut out the red meat among all meats. And if you don't want to cut out all red meat, at least cut down on it. But if you're going to have to eat meat, try to stick with the white variety rather than the red variety. If you have to have some of the red variety, cut down on it. There are a lot of reasons for it. And I'm sure that there are so many arguments running around out there about, that involve these arguments for and against the idea that I'm not going to go into them here. I'm giving a general guideline. Cut back on it, and if you can handle it, cut it all out. And add in other foods. If you're used to having meat, which is fairly substantial substance, by the way, then you might need to, add more of the other stuff you eat for a while. At least add more foods that are packed with amino acids to make up for the difference in protein that your body might experience. Now, again, a lot of this has to do also with the other the esoteric side of this, which we're going to get to. That's half the picture right there. It's a half that many people don't even consider. Even, they might want to know about it, but they don't know much about it. Anyway, it's the less known half. And we'll get to that. But for right now, insofar as meat or not meat, or some meat, is a big topic, I'm just going to address it. I'm going to share a little information about, largely here, what other people have said about it, people whose names we know. But first, a little background information. On with the classes. Let's see. Oh, by the way, there are several types of vegetarians. What I have here in my hand says there are 3 different kinds of vegetarians. I'm going to say there are 4. The 3 mentioned here are the lacto-ovo vegetarians. They include dairy products and eggs in their diet, but they include flesh of all animals. That includes meat, poultry, fish, and seafoods. Then there are the pure vegetarians, on the other hand, who abstain from the use of all foods of animal origin for health reasons. And then there are vegans who also use no foods of animal origin, but it's because of their ideology rather than for reasons of health. So if a person abstains from all animal products, foods, that have anything to do with animals, all animal foods, all foods of animal origin, because of their ideology, as well as for health reasons, then they are pure vegetarian vegans. Well, I'm going to say there's a 4th kind of vegetarian, and that's the kind of vegetarian who says, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. I don't eat animals. I don't eat anything of animal origin, but I eat fish. I have run into some of these people. Now, you might be, I don't know, maybe you're one of them. So if it's you specifically, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at that other guy who said that to me specifically. There were a couple of them. The same idea seems to go around among some people that, birds, fowl, aren't animals. So they don't eat meat. They don't eat, they're vegetarians, but they eat, chicken. It's kind of like, walking up to me and saying, hey, I hear you're a vegetarian. And I say, yeah. Well, even though right now, me personally, I'm not, but it's hypothetical. Let's say back when I was a pure vegetarian, okay? or real close to it. I probably ate an egg and drank some milk now and then. I don't know. But anyway, back when I was, let's say somebody walks up to me and says, "You're a vegetarian?" I say, "Yeah." And they say, "Me too. Want to get some chicken?" Or let's get a fish sandwich. You know, that's not an animal. Well, let me ask you this. Let's just get clear on what an animal is. So that when we're talking about whether to eat meat or not, or vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism, we know what food types are included in that talk. If you're not real sure about it, ask yourself this. How many biological kingdoms are there on the planet? Plants and animals, last I heard, right? And how many kingdoms in general, I mean overall, in addition to, including the biological? Excuse me, I'm sorry, I was at work the last several days out in cold, wet, 8 to 10 hours at a time, shoveling ice and snow and water. And my throat's got a little bit of a scratch here, and I am coughing, in case you hadn't noticed. And I've been talking here a while, and it is getting a little scratchy, so if I'm coughing. Beg your pardon, but I'm on a roll here. I'm getting said what I have to say, and I'm not going to stop because I'm coughing. All right. Ask yourself this question. Is a fish a plant? No? All right. Is it a mineral? Is a fish a mineral? No? I mean, that's the other kingdom, right? The so-called inorganic one, the inorganic one. Minerals, plants, and animals. The three great kingdoms. Well, if the fish isn't a plant and it's not a mineral, it must be an animal. So when we talk about not eating animals or, being a vegetarian, well, if you're a vegetarian, then you can't get away with eating fish and birds. Simple little point to be made. I just wanted to get clear on that, so that we know what we're talking about. That's all. So I add in a fourth kind of vegetarian, the kind who aren't really vegetarians because they eat fish or they eat birds. Anyway, in other words, they're pseudo-vegetarians. Now, although not strict vegetarians themselves, the Greek philosophers Pythagoras, there he is, Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato popularized the idea and supported such a program as natural and hygienic. And in the Western world or the civilizations that go back to, in some way, the Greek civilization, in ideology, in genealogy, or whatever, Pythagoras is considered to be the founder of the vegetarian movement. But he is known to have eaten meat on occasion. Okay? From the dawn of recorded history, some, for one reason or another, have followed a vegetarian regimen. Even though vegetarian diets often are followed as a necessity, particularly among the poor, the health benefits are evident if sufficient food is available. This means if all you have is meat laying around and there's not much else, well, then you probably should eat the meat. Don't be afraid of it. What did Gandhi say about it? Excuse me. He said, "I don't regard flesh food as necessary for us at any stage and under any clime in which it is possible for human beings ordinarily to live." He said, "I hold flesh food to be unsuited for our species." We err in copying the lower world if we're superior to it. Experience teaches that animal food is unsuited to those who would curb their passions. Now, many people have great respect for that man who, of the Italian Renaissance. Let's see. Leonardo, what was his last name? Where was he from? Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci. Great respect for him. Now, to find out that he was a vegetarian, I'm not sure some people would, I don't know. Maybe that would change their opinion of him. But listen to what he said. The great vegetarian and artist and scientific inventor Leonardo da Vinci was of the same mind. He said, truly man is the king of the beasts, for his brutality exceeds theirs. We live by the death of others. We are burial places. He said, I have from an early age abjured the use of meat, and the time will come when men such as I will look upon the murder of animals as they now look upon the murder of men. Who else do we have? Jeffrey Rudd. I don't know if you've heard of him. Let's pretend you did. An integrated view of life as a whole will reveal to us the connection between the individual's food and his behavior toward others. And through a process of ratiocination, which is not fantastic, we cannot but arrive at a conclusion. The conclusion that the only means of escaping the hydrogen bomb is to escape the type of mentality which has produced it. And the only way to escape that mentality is to cultivate respect for all life, life in all forms, under all conditions. In one aspect, that's another name for vegetarianism. How about Leo Tolstoy? What did he say? Count Leo Tolstoy also recognized the ways in which preying upon animals could stunt the peaceful aspirations and the spiritual growth of humanity. He said, this is dreadful. He said, not only the suffering and the death of the animals, but that man suppresses in himself unnecessarily the highest spiritual capacity, that of sympathy and pity toward living creatures like himself, and by violating his own feelings becomes cruel. And there's the Nobel Prize winning poet, Rabindranath Tagore. He said, we manage to swallow flesh. We manage to, only because we don't think of the cruel and horrible thing we do. There are many crimes which are the creation of man himself, the wrongfulness of which is put down in their divergence from habit and custom or tradition, but cruelty isn't one of those. Cruelty is a fundamental thing and admits of no arguments or nice distinctions. If only we do not allow our heart to grow callous, it protests against cruelty. It's always clearly heard, and yet we go on perpetrating cruelties easily, merrily, all of us. In fact, anyone who does not join in is dubbed as a crank. If after our pity is aroused, we persist in throttling our feelings simply in order to join others in preying upon life, we insult all that is good in us. I've decided to try the vegetarian diet. That's what Rabindranath Tagore said. And then there's Dr. Annie Besant. Hopefully you've heard of her. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. At some point, I'm going to present some of her material here on my channel. And it should fall well in step with William Walker Atkinson's stuff. She said, I could tell you stories of yogis there in India, harmless in every act of thought and life, who will go through jungles where tigers are crouching, and the tiger will sometimes come and lie at their feet and lick their feet. Harmless as a kitten might be in the face of the spirit of love. Now, she's not talking about those Siberian tigers like we find in stage acts excuse me, like those two stage illusionists. I forget their names. One of them was finally attacked by one of his tigers, but they were great white tigers, Siberian tigers, kind of trainable, you know. I mean, they were friendly up until one of them attacked him, but no, she's talking about Bengal tigers of India, the Royal Bengal tigers of India, ferocious animals. I mean, real bona fide, hardcore, 100% predators. I could tell you stories of yogis there, harnessed in every act of thought, and go through jungles where tigers are crossing, and the tiger will sometimes come and lie at their feet and lick their feet, harmless as a kitten might be in the face of the spirit of love. And though in truth it would now take many a century to undo the evil of a blood-stained past, still the undoing is possible. The friendliness might be made, and each man, each woman who in life is friendly to the lower creatures, is adding his or her quota to the love in the world, which ultimately will subdue all things to itself. The vegetarian that I am going to argue about tonight, she continues, is that which will be familiar to all of you as the abstinence from all those kinds of food which imply the slaying of animals or cruelty inflicted upon the animal. Every person who eats meat takes a share in that degradation of their fellow men as slaughterers. On him and on her personally lies the share, and personally lies the responsibility. Bernard Shaw. While we ourselves are the living graves of murdered animals, how can we expect any ideal conditions on the earth? When a man wants to murder a tiger, he calls it sport. And when a tiger wants to murder him, well, he calls it ferocity. Henry David Thoreau. He will be regarded as a benefactor of his race who will teach man to confine himself to a more innocent diet. Whatever my own practice may be, I have no doubt that it is a part of the destiny of the human race in its gradual development to leave off eating animals as surely as the savage tribes have left off eating each other. The faintest assured objection which one healthy man feels will at length prevail over the arguments and customs of mankind. No humane being past the thoughtless age of boyhood will wantonly murder any creature which holds its life the same tenure that he does. And H.P.B. Madame Blavatsky. The principle involved in a bonnet which is decorated with the plumage of a single bird slaughtered for its sake is the same as that which would be more grotesquely manifest in a garment that would require the slaughter of 500. Too many rich people in this greedy age forget that the grandest privilege of those who possess the means is that they have the power of alleviating suffering. And too many, again, forget that the sympathies of those who rule the animate world should extend beyond the limits of their own kind. The writer, she continues, is not simple enough to imagine that a whole British museum filled with works against the flesh diet would have the effect of stopping civilized nations from having slaughterhouses or making them renounce their beefsteak and Christmas goose. Now, one last thing here before moving on. I want to show you something. Look at this picture. See this? See if I can hold it still for you. All right, have a look. This is human. This is monkey. Right? They go together under the heading indicating non-carnivore. This is mountain lion. This is wolf. They go together under the heading carnivore. non-carnivore. General characteristics of the skull: large pointed fangs, absence of those characteristics. Now, that's just one anatomical difference. Many others exist. Excuse me. And when we get into physiology, many more comparisons come up. It is the case, from everything I have experienced and everything I have studied about this, I have concluded that meat eating, the idea that it is required and necessary, is more of an addiction. It's more one of those things that's part of like addictive substances, right? Getting addicted to, like nicotine and so forth, than a necessity in the human diet. But I am not saying stop eating meat. I am answering a question that was asked of me. And I am addressing, with this discourse, this part of the discourse here, a big subject, a big part of the subject matter. Meat or not meat, or some meat. And if some meat, what meat? Now, on to William Walker Atkinson. But at first, here, I have to find exactly what I wanted to read to you. So give me a moment, and then I will do it. And by the way, while I'm looking for it, I will tell you what it is. We know what yoga is, okay? Most people have an idea of what yoga is. Now, I think I see what I'm looking for here. Nope, not yet. I'm going to have to find it here. And I'm sorry I didn't have it out in the first place. But now here's the thing. Yoga, right? Yoga is a comprehensive system. The ultimate goal of yoga is self-actualization, self-realization, movement to a true selfhood. And yoga is so comprehensive. The ancient form of yoga in India is so comprehensive that it breaks into many subcategories. And one of those subcategories is Raja Yoga. And I want to point something out. While I'm just talking about yoga and its subcategories, all of the subcategories of yoga have to work together as a system. Okay? And there are various different ways to group this all together. Many different ways to group it all together, and different ways to classify, what details fall under what category. They all blend together, and distinctions, while in some cases, as a general principle or as a general rule, they're distinguishable from one another. Then there are areas in which they dovetail and overlap by necessity, because they're all part of a whole system. And I'm pointing this out because there's one area that many people forget about whenever they're thinking about yoga and the whole system. Now, some people say that Kriya Yoga, well, one connotation of the name Kriya Yoga, that's the whole system. That's like the super highway method or approach to the entirety of yoga. Others will say that it's called Ashtanga Yoga. But you know what? Many of these ideologies are concepts of the whole picture of yoga leave out that major part having to do with sex, which most people take to be what's called Tantra Yoga. people who don't really understand the true nature of Tantra yoga will say, well, Tantra yoga is, that's like the yoga of sex. Really, Tantra yoga is the form of yoga that is, yes, it involves sex and all the other forms together. It is the whole picture. Now, regardless of how we break it up, though, excuse me for the coughing again, regardless of how we break this all up, right, there is a branch of yoga called Raja Yoga, and a part of it is Hatha Yoga. Now, here in the Western world, when we go to yoga classes and we assume various physical poses and we breathe in, breathe out, we're engaging in Hatha Yoga and only part of it. Not even all of it. Hatha Yoga includes much more than that. Now, I am about to land on what I'm talking about. Yep, there it is. All right. Hatha Yoga really is the yogi philosophy of physical well-being. That includes more than physical exercises, physical conditioning, and by the way, even the physical conditioning side. Many people who go to yoga classes don't even understand what all that involves. But see, it also includes things like nourishment, which is the topic of this video. So why was I talking about yoga? Because I'm going to read to you from William Walker Atkinson's book called Hatha Yoga, the Yogi Philosophy of Physical Well-Being, in which he discusses nourishment. Now, why would William Walker Atkinson, if you're familiar with the arcane teachings and the arcane formulas, write a book about yoga? Well, actually, the name of the author of the book is Yogi Ramacharaka, a name which you will recognize because my username here on YouTube is Theron Q Ramacharaka. Theron Q comes from a name Theron Q Dumont. I took the Theron Q from that name. Yogi Ramacharaka, William Walker Atkinson, Theron Q Dumont, Swami Panchadasi, who is the author of my series that I am currently in the process of getting fully posted here on my channel, the Astral World series. They're all the same person. His real name is William Walker Atkinson. He was a person who produced a prolific amount of writings and used various pen names, and he was an occultist as well as other things in this life. And he was quite skilled and knowledgeable in many areas of occultism, mysticism, and esotericism, including he was a yogi of the Indian tradition. And he wrote considerable material about that subject, and he did it from a rather occult perspective. And when it comes right down to it, a yogi is an occultist. So when writing anything having to do with that side of his life, his yogi side, he used, for example, often the name Yogi Ramacharaka. I chose that name and combined it with Theron Q Dumont to come up with my YouTube username out of respect for his work. And when I started this channel here, I didn't plan on getting into all of the material that I'm getting into. I may have, considered using my own name in the first place, but I had no such plans. I was just, reading some poetical works of Robert W. Service here, and I just, thought, yeah, I'm going to, pick a couple of Atkinson's pen names. But anyway, the name of the author of this book is Yogi Ramacharaka, and it is William Walker Atkinson. And it was published in the year 1904. So I'm going to read just part of this, only the parts that are relevant here. And let me scroll down and find where I feel like beginning. How about this? I'm going to read to you from the chapter, starting off here, give you some background information. Now remember, this is going to involve an esoteric side of the affair. That's half of nourishment, okay? The yogi's regard for the physical body. To the casual observer, the yogi philosophy presents the apparent anomaly of a teaching which, while holding that the physical body is material and as nothing compared to the higher principles of man, at the same time devotes much care and importance to the instruction of its students in the direction of the careful attention, the nourishment, the training, exercise, and improvement of that physical body. In fact, one whole branch of the yogi teachings, Hatha Yoga, is devoted to this care of the physical body and goes into considerable detail regarding the instruction of its students in the principles of this physical training and development. Some Western travelers in the Orient who have seen the care which the yogis bestow upon their bodies and the time and attention which they devote to the task have jumped to the conclusion that the yogi philosophy is merely an Oriental form of physicalism, physical culture, just a little more carefully studied than its Western counterpart perhaps, but a system having nothing spiritual in it. Well, so much for seeing merely the outer forms and not knowing enough to look behind the scenes. We're going to look behind the scenes. Excuse me. We scarcely need to explain to our students the real reason for the yogi's care for the body, nor need we apologize for the publication of this little book, which has for its end the instruction of yogi students in the care and scientific development of the physical body. The yogis believe, that the real man is not his body. They know that the immortal I, of which each human being is conscious to a greater or lesser degree, is not the body which it merely occupies and uses. They know the body for what it is and aren't deceived into the belief that it's the real person. But while knowing these things, they also know that the body is the instrument in which and by which the spirit manifests and works. They know that the fleshly covering is necessary for man's manifestation and growth in this particular stage of his development. They know that the body is the temple of the spirit. And they consequently believe that the care and the development of the body is as worthy a task as is the development of some of the higher parts of man. For with an unhealthy and imperfectly developed physical body, the mind can't function properly, nor can the instrument be used to the best advantage by its master, the spirit. It is true that the yogi goes beyond this point and insists that the body be brought under the perfect control of the mind, that the instrument be finally turned so as to be responsive to the touch of the hand of the master, the spirit. But the yogi knows that the highest degree of responsiveness on the part of the body may be obtained only when the body is properly cared for, nourished, and developed. The highly trained body must first of all be a strong, healthy one. For these reasons, the yogi pays such great attention and care to the physical side of his nature, and for the same reason, the Oriental system of physical culture forms a part of the yogi's science of Hatha Yoga. The Western physical culture enthusiast develops his body for his body's sake, often believing that the body is he. The yogi develops the body knowing it to be but an instrument for the use of the real part of himself, and solely that he may perfect the instrument to the end that it may be used in the work of soul growth. The yogi throws mind into the task and develops not only the muscle but every organ, cell, and part of his body as well. Now, this throwing mind into the task, when applied to nutrition, this is the other half of nourishment. And we're going to talk about that. And if you've looked at some of his other works, like the Arcane Formulas, and you got to the last lesson in that, lesson 10, being the 11th video in that series, that lesson called Mentalism in a Nutshell, then you have an idea of what putting your mind into something really means behind the scenes. It's not just a matter of, thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it. There's more to it. And going about something with this kind of knowledge that we're talking about here adds new weight to those different levels upon which what you're doing is actually happening. It helps it all to happen better. So if you want nourishment, you want to address that side of affairs, then knowing how it's working and what's going on and going about your activity with those things in mind and intending for them to work at their most efficient level, that's part of the game. Scrolling down. Now, the body needs material from the outside with which to build up and repair its parts. And nature provides means of eating food, of digesting it, of extracting the nutritious elements, of converting it into shape for absorption by the system, and of excreting the waste portions. And it's well worth the time of anyone to study something of the wonderful mechanism and workings of the human body. And one gets from this study a most convincing realization of the reality of that great intelligence in nature. He sees the great life principle in operation. He sees that it's not blind to chance or haphazard happening, but that it is the work of a mighty intelligence. And then he learns to trust that intelligence and to know that that which brought him into physical being will carry him through life. That the power which took charge of him then has charge of him now and will always have charge of him. And as we open ourselves to the inflow of the great life principle, so will we be benefited. If we fear it or don't trust it, well, then we shut the door on it, and we necessarily then suffer. Many people make the mistake of considering disease as an entity, a real thing, an opponent of health, and that's not correct. Health is the natural state of the person, and disease is simply the absence of it. There is within every physical body a certain vital force, you see, which is constantly doing the best it can for us, notwithstanding the reckless way in which we violate the cardinal principles of right living. And much of that we call disease is but a defensive action of this vital force, a remedial effect. It's not a downward action, but an upward action on the part of a living organism. The action is abnormal because the conditions are abnormal. And the whole recuperative effort of the vital force is exerted toward the restoration of normal conditions. I'm looking for where I need to be now. We're talking about vital force. I'm done talking about that now. I'm skipping an entire chapter here where it's telling us about the anatomical and physiological aspects of digestion in a chapter called The Laboratory of the Body. Now, I'm getting to where we need to be. And I'm glad you're bearing with me. The human body is constantly undergoing change. Atoms of bone, tissue, muscle, fat, and fluids are constantly being worn out and removed from the system, and new atoms are constantly being manufactured in the wonderful laboratory of the body and then sent to take the place of the worn out and discarded material. So let's consider the physical body of man and its mechanism as a plant. And indeed, it is akin to the plant, to the life of the plant in its nature. I mean, what does the plant require to bring it up from seed to sprout, and from sprout to plant with flower, seed, and fruit anyway? The answer is simple. It needs fresh air, it needs sunlight, water, and nourishing soil. These things, and all of them, must it have in order to grow to healthy maturity. And man's physical body requires just the same things, all of them, in order to be healthy, strong, and normal. Remember the requisites here: fresh air, sunlight, water, and food. We will consider the matter of air, sunlight, and water in other chapters, and we'll consider the matter of nourishing food first. Now, just as the plant grows slowly but steadily, so does this great work of discarding worn-out material and the substitution of new material go on constantly, day and night. We're not conscious of this mighty work. It belongs to the great subconscious part of man's nature. It's part of the work of the instinctive mind. The whole of the body and all its parts depend for health, strength, and vigor upon this constant renewal of material. And if this material were stopped, disintegration and death, if this renewal were stopped, disintegration and death would ensue. The replacing of the worn out and discarded material The replacing of the worn out and the discarded material is an imperative necessity of our organism, and therefore is the first thing to be considered when we think of the healthy man. The keynote of this subject of food in the Hatha Yoga philosophy is the Sanskrit word, the English equivalent of which is nourishment. We wish our students to associate the thought of food with the thought of nourishment. To the yogi, food does not mean something to tickle the abnormal palate, but instead it means first, nourishment, second, nourishment, and third, nourishment. Nourishment first, last, and always. To many of the Western people, the ideal yogi is a lean, lank, scrawny, half-starved, emaciated-looking being who thinks so little of food that he goes for days without it. One who considers food to be too material for his spiritual nature. Well, nothing can be further from the truth. The yogis, at least those who are well grounded in Hatha Yoga, anyway, regard nourishment as his first duty towards his body. And he is always careful to keep that body properly nourished, and to see that the supply of new, fresh material is always at least equal to the worn out and discarded matter. And it's quite true that the yogi is not a gross eater, nor is he inclined to rich and fancy dishes. On the contrary, he smiles at the folly of these things and goes to his plain and nourishing meal, knowing that he'll obtain their full nourishment without the waste and harmful matter contained in the more elaborate dishes of his brother, who is ignorant of the real meaning of food. A maxim of Hatha Yoga is, it's not what a man eats, but the amount that he assimilates that nourishes him. There's a world of wisdom in that old maxim. It contains that which writers upon health subjects have taken volumes to express. We'll show you later on the yogi method of extracting the maximum amount of nourishment from the minimum amount of food. The yogi method lies in the middle of the road, the two opposite sides of which road are traveled, respectively, by the two different Western schools, namely the food stuffers on the one hand and the starvationists on the other, each of whom loudly proclaim the merits of their own cult and decry the claims of the opposing sect. The simple yogi may be pardoned for smiling good-naturedly at the disputes raging between these two, preaching the necessity of sufficient nutrition, teaching that stuffing is necessary to obtain it on the one hand, and at those of the opposing school who, recognizing the folly of stuffing and overeating, have no remedy to offer but semi-starvation, accompanied with long continued fasts, which, of course, has brought many of his followers down to weakened bodies, impaired vitality, and even to death. To the yogi, the evils of malnutrition on the one hand and overeating on the other do not exist. These questions have been settled for him centuries ago by the old yogi fathers, whose very names have been almost forgotten by their followers of today. Remember, please, once and for all, that Hatha Yoga does not advocate the plan of starving, but on the contrary, knows and teaches that no human body can be strong and healthy unless it's properly nourished by sufficient food eaten and assimilated. Many delicate, weak, and nervous people owe their impaired vitality and diseased condition to the fact that they don't obtain sufficient nourishment. And remember also that Hatha Yoga rejects as ridiculous the theory that nourishment is obtained from stuffing, gorging, or overeating, and views with wonder and pity these attributes of the glutton, and sees nothing in these practices but the manifestation of the attributes of the unclean swine, utterly unworthy of the developed man. To the yogi, understanding man should eat to live. To the yogi understanding, man should eat to live, not live to eat. The yogi is an epicure rather than a gourmand. For while eating the plainest food, he has cultivated and encouraged his natural and normal taste so that his hunger imparts to these simple viands a relish sought after, but not obtained by those who hunt after rich and expensive triumphs of the chef. While eating for nourishment as his main object, he manages to make his food yield him a pleasure unknown to his brother who scorns the simple fare. In our next chapter, we'll take up the subject of hunger and appetite, two entirely different attributes of the physical body, although to most people the two appear to mean almost the same thing. Hunger versus appetite. Now, as we said at the conclusion of the preceding chapter, hunger and appetite are two entirely different attributes of the human body. Hunger is the normal demand for food. Appetite is abnormal craving. Hunger is like the rosy hue upon the cheek of a healthy child. Appetite, is like the rouged face of a woman of fashion. And yet most people use the terms as if their meanings were identical. Let's see wherein lies the difference. It's quite difficult to explain the respective sensations or symptoms of hunger and appetite to the average person who has attained the age of maturity. For the majority of persons of that age have had their natural taste or hunger instinct perverted by appetite to such an extent that they have not experienced the sensation of genuine hunger for many years, and have forgotten just what it felt like. And it's hard to describe a sensation unless one can pull up in the mind of his hearer the recollection of the same, or some similar sensation experienced at some time in the past. We can describe a sound to a person of normal hearing by comparing it with something he has heard, but the difficulty of conveying an intelligent idea of a sound to one who is born stone deaf, now, to one who has emancipated himself from the thrall of appetite, the respective sensations of hunger and appetite are quite different and readily distinguished from one from the other, and the mind of such a one readily grasps the precise meaning of each term. But to the ordinary so-called civilized man, hunger means the source of appetite, and appetite the result of hunger. Both words are being misused in that case. We must illustrate this by familiar examples. Let's take thirst, for example. All of us know the sensation of a good natural thirst, which calls for a draught of cold water, right? It's felt in the mouth and the throat and can be satisfied only with which nature intended for it, cool water. Now, this natural thirst is akin to natural hunger, see? Now, how different is this natural thirst from the craving which one acquires for sweetened, flavored soda water, ice cream soda, ginger ale, pop, soft drinks, and so forth? And how different from the thirst which one feels for beer, if we can use the word thirst at all here, alcoholic liquors and so forth, after the taste has been acquired for them. Do you begin to see what we mean? We hear people say that they are so thirsty for a glass of soda, or others say that they are thirsty for a drink of whiskey. Now, if these people were really thirsty, or in other words, if nature was really calling for fluids, pure water would be just what they would first seek for, and pure water would be the thing that would best gratify that thirst. But no, water will not satisfy this soda water or whiskey thirst. Why? Well, simply because it's a craving of an appetite, which is not a natural thirst, but which is, on the contrary, an abnormal appetite, a perverted taste. The appetite has been created, the habit acquired, and it is asserting the mastery. You will notice that the victims of these abnormal thirsts will occasionally experience a real thirst, on occasion, at which times water alone will be sought by them. And the tipple of the appetite, not even thought of at those moments. Now just think a moment. Is it not the case with you? Now, this is not a lecture directed against the fancy drink habit, no. Or a temperance sermon, no. It's just an illustration of the difference between a natural instinct and an acquired habit or appetite. That's what we're doing here. Appetite is an acquired habit of eating or drinking, and has but little to do with real hunger or thirst. A man acquires an appetite for tobacco in any of its forms, or for liquor, or for chewing gum, or opium, morphine, cocaine, similar drugs. And an appetite, once acquired, becomes, if anything, stronger than that natural demand for food or drink. For men have been known to die of starvation because they spent all their money on drink or on narcotics. People have sold their babies' stockings for drink, have stolen, even murdered in order to gratify their appetite for narcotics. And yet who would think of calling this terrible craving of appetite by the name of hunger? And yet we continue to speak of and think of every craving for something to put in the stomach as hunger. While many of these cravings are as much a symptom of appetite as is the craving or desire for alcohol or narcotics. The lower animal has a natural hunger until it's spoiled by contact with man or woman, who tempts it with candies and similar articles, miscalled food. The young child has a natural hunger until it is spoiled in the same way. In the child, natural hunger is more or less replaced by acquired appetites, the degree depending largely upon the amount of wealth its parents possess. The greater the wealth, the greater the acquirement of false appetite. And as it grows older, it loses all recollection of what real hunger means. In fact, people speak of hunger as a distressing thing rather than as a natural instinct. Sometimes men go out camping, and the open air, exercise, and the natural life gives them again a taste of real hunger. And they eat like schoolboys and with a relish they haven't known for years. They feel hungry in earnest, as they do when they are at home and are overloading. They feel hungry in earnest and eat because they have to, not from mere habit, as they do when they are home and are overloading their stomachs continually. We recently read of a party of wealthy people who were shipwrecked while on a yachting or pleasure trip. They were compelled to live on the most meager fare for about 10 days. When rescued, they looked a picture of health, rosy, bright-eyed, and possessed of a precious gift of a good natural hunger. Some of the party had been dyspeptics for years, but the 10 days experience with food scarce and at a premium had completely cured them of their dyspepsia and other troubles. They had obtained sufficient to properly nourish them, and had gotten rid of the waste products of the system which had been poisoning them. Whether or not they stayed cured, so to speak, depended on whether they again exchanged hunger for appetite. Natural hunger, like natural thirst, expresses itself through the nerves, of the mouth and the throat. And when one is hungry, the thought or mention of food causes a peculiar sensation in the mouth, throat, and the salivary glands. The nerves of those parts manifest a peculiar sensation, the saliva begins to flow, and the whole of the region manifests a desire to get to work. The stomach gives no symptoms whatsoever. It's not at all in evidence at such times. When one feels that the taste of good wholesome food would be most pleasurable. There is none of those feelings of faintness, emptiness, gnawing, all goneness, and so forth in the region of the stomach. In the case of natural hunger. The last mentioned symptoms are all characteristics of the appetite habit, which is insisting that the habit must be continued. Did you ever notice that the drink habit calls forth those symptoms too? The craving and the all-gone feeling is characteristic of both forms of abnormal appetite. The man who is craving a smoke or a chew of tobacco feels pretty much the same way. A man often wonders why he can't get a dinner such as mother used to cook. Do you know why he can't get it? Well, it's simply because he has replaced his natural hunger by an abnormal appetite. And he doesn't feel satisfied unless he gratifies that appetite, which renders the homely fare of the past an impossibility. If the man were to cultivate a natural hunger by a return to first principles, he would have restored to him the meals of his youth. He would find many cooks just as good as mother was, for he would be a boy again, with respect to the matter. You're probably wondering what all this has to do with Hatha Yoga. Well, it has this to do with it. The yogi has conquered appetite, and he allows hunger to manifest through him. He enjoys every mouthful of food, even to the crust of dry bread, and obtains nourishment and pleasure from it. He eats it in a manner unknown to most people, which would be described a little further on. And so far from being a half-starved anchorite, he's a well-fed, properly nourished enjoyer of the feast, for he has possessed himself of that most piquant of all sauces, hunger. The yogi theory and practice of prana absorption from food. This is that other half of nourishment that I talked about. I told you, I asked you, please wait until we get there because it's laid out very nicely here. If I had tried to explain it, I wouldn't have done as well. Nature's shrewdness in combining several duties into one and also in rendering necessary duties pleasant and thereby likely to be performed is illustrated in numberless ways. One of the most striking examples of this kind will be brought out momentarily. We will see how nature manages to accomplish several things at the same time, and how she also renders pleasant several most necessary offices of the physical system. Let's start with the statement of the yogi theory of the absorption of prana from food. This theory holds that there is contained in the food of man and the lower animals a certain form of prana, which is absolutely necessary for man's maintenance of strength and energy. And that such form of prana is absorbed from the food by the nerves of the tongue and the mouth in general and the teeth. The act of mastication liberates this prana by separating the particles of the food into minute bits, thus exposing as many atoms of prana. Now, atoms is being used in a specific way here. Atoms of prana to the tongue, mouth, and teeth as possible. We might call them pranatoms. Each atom of food contains numerous electrons of food prana or food energy, which electrons are liberated by the breaking up process of mastication and the chemical action of certain subtle chemical constituents of the saliva, the presence of which has not been suspected by modern scientists, and which are not discernible by the tests of modern chemistry, although future investigators will scientifically prove their existence. And once liberated from the food, this food prana flies to the nerves of the tongue. Now you'll know that the nutrient side of nourishment ends up in the blood. Prana ends up in the nerves. From whence it is conveyed to all parts of the body, where it is used to furnish energy and vitality to the cells. And this is a bare statement of the theory, the details of which we will endeavor to fill in as we proceed. The student will probably wonder why it's necessary to extract this food prana. I mean, insofar as the air is heavily charged with prana, and it might seem like a waste of effort on the part of nature to use so much energy in order to extract prana from food. But here's the explanation. Just as all electricity is electricity, so is all prana simply prana. But just as there are several forms of the electric current manifesting widely different effects upon the human body, so there are several manifestations or forms of prana, each of which performs certain work in the physical body, and all of which are needed for the different kinds of work. The prana of the air fulfills certain offices, that of water others, and that derived from the food still a third set of duties. To go into the minute details of the yogi theory would be far into the purposes of this work, and we must rest content with the general statement here given. Again, general guidelines. The main subject before us is the fact that the food contains food prana, which the human body needs, and which it can extract only in the manner above stated, that is, by the mastication of the food and the absorption of the prana by the nervous system by means of the nerves of the tongue, the mouth, and the teeth. Now, let's consider nature's plan in combining two important offices in the act of masticating and in salivating. In the first place, nature intended every particle of food to be thoroughly masticated and insalivated before it was swallowed. And any neglect in this respect is sure to be followed by imperfect digestion, whether or not we're aware of it. Thorough mastication is a natural habit of man which has been neglected owing to the demands of artificial habits of living which have grown up around our civilization. Mastication is necessary to break up the food so that it is more easily swallowed, and also that it may be mixed with the saliva and the digestive juices of the stomach and the small intestines. We all know this. It promotes the flow of saliva, which is the most necessary part of the process of digestion. Insalivation of the food is part of the digestive process, and certain work is done by the saliva which can't be performed by the other digestive juices. And physiologists teach most positively that thorough mastication and proper insalivation of the food are prerequisites of normal digestion and form a most necessary part of the process. This is common information to us, but it has a more uncommon side to it. And going about eating food in the right way like this, with the knowledge of what's really going on behind the scenes, is a tremendous difference from the normal way of eating food these days. This is the part that people don't normally think of when they're looking for, what should I eat? What's good information about food? This is half of it. In other words, this is information that some of us know of, but maybe not to the full extent. Probably not to its fullest extent. But given what they know of it, They don't tend to regard that as a full 50% of the picture or greater. Certain specialists have gone much further and have given to the process of mastication and in salivation much more importance than have the general run of physiologists. Now, one particular authority, a Mr. Horace Fletcher, an American writer, has written forcibly upon this subject and has given startling proofs of the importance of this function and process of the physical body. In fact, he advises a particular form of mastication which corresponds closely to the yogi custom, although he advises it because of its wonderful effect upon digestion, whereas the yogis practice a similar system upon the theory of the absorption of food prana. The truth is that both results are accomplished, it being a part of nature's strategy that the grinding of the food into small bits, the digestive process attending the insalivation, and the absorption of food prana are accomplished at the same time. An economy of force most remarkable. Now let's get more into this. In the natural state of man, mastication was a most pleasant process. And so it is in the case of the lower animals and the children of the human race of today. The animal chews and munches his food with the greatest relish. And the child sucks, chews, and holds in the mouth the food much longer than does the adult. Until it begins to take lessons from his parents, that is, and acquires the custom of bolting down his food. Mr. Fletcher, in his books on the subject, takes the position that it is taste which affords the pleasure of this chewing and the sucking process. The yogi theory is that while taste has a lot to do with it, still there's something else. An indescribable sense of satisfaction obtained from holding the food in the mouth, rolling it around with the tongue, masticating it and allowing it to dissolve slowly and to be swallowed almost unconsciously. Fletcher holds that while there remains a particle of taste in the mouth, in the food, nourishment is there to be extracted. And we believe this to be strictly correct, but we hold that there is that other sensation which, when we allow it to manifest itself, gives us a certain satisfaction in the non-swallowing, and which sensation continues until all, or nearly all, the food prana is extracted from the food. You will notice if you follow the yogi plan of eating, even partially, that you will be loath to part with the food. And that instead of bolting it at once, you will allow it to gradually melt away in the mouth until suddenly you realize it's all gone. This sensation is experienced from the plainest kinds of food, which do not appeal particularly to the taste even in all cases, as well as to those foods which are special favorites of your particular taste. The taste is irrelevant. To describe this sensation is almost impossible, for we don't have English words coined for it, as its existence hasn't been fully recognized by the Western races. The best we can do is to compare it with other sensations at the risk of being accused of presenting a ridiculous comparison. Here's what we mean. You know the sensation which one sometimes feels when in the presence of a highly magnetic person, so to speak? That indescribable feeling of the absorption of strength or vitality. Some people, you see, they have so much prana in their system that they are continually running over with it and giving it out to others. The result being that other people want to be in their company and they like it and they desire to leave it. They dislike to leave the company of that person, being almost unable to tear themselves away. This is one instance. Another is the sensation which one obtains from being close to another whom one loves. In this case, there is an interchange of magnetism, which being thought charged with prana, which is quite exhilarating. A kiss from the loved one is so filled with magnetism or thought charged with prana that it thrills one from head to toe. This gives an imperfect illustration of what we're trying to get at now. Not exactly the same thing. It's an imperfect illustration, but it's the kind of thing we're trying to get at in general. The pleasure that one obtains from proper and normal eating is not alone a matter of taste, but is largely derived from that peculiar sensation of the absorption of magnetism, let's say, or prana, which is very much akin to the examples above mentioned, although until one realizes the similar character of the two manifestations of energy, the illustration may just evoke a smile or maybe even ridicule. When one has overcome the false appetite, so often mistaken for hunger, he will masticate a dry crust of whole wheat bread and not only obtain a certain satisfaction of taste from the nourishment contained therein it, but will enjoy the sensation of which we have spoken of very keenly now. It takes a little practice in order to get rid of the false appetite habit and to return to nature's plans. The most nourishing of foods will yield the most satisfaction to the normal taste, and it is a fact to be remembered that food prana is contained in food in direct proportion to its percentage of nourishment. Another instance of nature's wisdom. The yogi eats his food slowly, masticating each mouthful so long as he feels like it. That is, so long as it yields him any satisfaction. In the majority of cases, this sensation lasts so long as there remains any food in the mouth, as nature's involuntary processes gradually causes the food to be slowly dissolved and swallowed. The yogi moves his jaws slowly and allows the tongue to caress the food and the teeth to sink into it lovingly, knowing that he is extracting the food prana from it. Now, I just have to interject here. Allows his teeth to sink into it lovingly. But after the material about the meat, like we're making our bodies into a graveyard. If you think like that and try to sink your teeth lovingly into that meat, oh well. Doesn't seem to fit. Sink in lovingly, knowing that he is extracting the food prana from it. See, knowing that that's what's happening. I said, like I was saying, knowing what's happening and intending for it to happen as efficiently and thoroughly as possible is part of the game. It's part of the game. And that he is being stimulated and strengthened by it, and that he is replenishing his reservoir of energy. At the same time, he is conscious that he is preparing his food in the proper way for the digestive process of the stomach and the small intestines. All at the same time, all this awareness going on at the same time. And he is giving his body good material needed for the building up of the physical body. Those who follow this yogi plan of eating will obtain a far greater amount of nourishment from their food than does the ordinary person. Not just the mouth thing, but the knowledge of it and the intention for it to be the best it can be in these ways. Putting the mind into it in an appropriate manner. Every ounce when this plan of eating is followed, every ounce is forced to yield up its maximum nourishment. While in the case of the man who bolts down his food of half-masticated food, his mouthful of half-masticated food and insufficiently insalivated food, a lot goes to waste and is passed from the system in the shape of decaying, fermenting mass. Under the yogi plan, nothing is passed from the system as waste, except real waste. Every particle of nourishment having been extracted from the food, and the greater portion of the food prana being absorbed from its atoms. Food prana being absorbed from its atoms. Mastication breaks up the food into small particles, allowing the fluids of the saliva to interpenetrate it, the digestive juices of the saliva performing their necessary work, and the other juices mentioned earlier in this book acting upon the atoms of food in such a way as to liberate the prana, thus allowing it to be taken up by the nervous system. Now, I want to point something out. In his book, in Atkinson's book, now here his name's Yogi Ramacharaka, okay, but it's William Walker Atkinson. In his book that I am posting here, currently, in the process of posting, I have recorded all the chapters, and I am in the middle of posting them. The book is called The Astral World, written by Swami Panchadasi, another of William Walker Atkinson's names. He mentions that in passing in the little journey that he takes us on, from the material plane into the astral plane, we pass through momentarily the plane of forces. And there, in our little guided tour of the astral plane, while we can see the phenomena of just a minute portion of the range of vibrations perceivable in the plane of forces, you can physically or visibly see forces at work, like the atomic forces. That you can see them. You can see magnetism at work. You can see the poles of a magnet glowing. You can see a radiance in the atmosphere, which is gravity, the force of gravity. If a signal is passing through the air, you can see it like a streak going by. Okay? Now, here, this is the plane of forces, and this is where the atomic forces, the weak force, the strong force, and so forth, this is where they are occurring. These are the forces. They are not of the physical plane. It's not the same as like the rays, X-rays and so forth. They're physical plane phenomena. But the forces are plane of forces belong to a different plane. And what I've been saying here is there's the physical plane side of food and nourishment, and then there's the plane of forces side, which is the prana. And he just said here that the prana is liberated from the atoms by an act of mastication and saliva and the right mindset to do it. So, the physical action and the mindset working together with the chemistry involved has a certain relationship with the food, such that when certain actions are performed together in the right manner, a plane of forces phenomena occurs more efficiently and effectively. That's the other half of nourishment. When that half is taken into consideration and brought into, instantiated, fully instantiated, the choice of food becomes less important, with the exception of general principles, like don't go for the fancy dishes. Don't go for the things that are further away from nature. Don't eat things that are old when you have things that are young available. The general principles I was laying out before. Just follow the general guidelines in a general manner and instantiate the other 50% of the nourishment process. The motion imparted to the food by the action of the jaws, tongue, and cheeks in the act of mastication causes it to present new atoms to the nerves ready to extract the food prana. In fact, the yogis hold the food in the mouth, masticating it slowly and thoroughly and allowing it to be slowly swallowed by the involuntary process above alluded to. And they experience to the full the enjoyment attendant upon the extraction of prana. You get an idea of this by taking into the mouth some particle of food when you have plenty of time for the experiment, and then slowly masticating it, allowing it to gradually melt away in the mouth as you would a lump of sugar. You'll be surprised to find how thoroughly this work of involuntary swallowing is performed. The food gradually yields up its food prana and then melts slowly away and reaches the stomach. Take a crust of bread, for example, and masticate it thoroughly, with the idea of seeing how long it will last without being swallowed. You'll find that it will never be swallowed in the usual way. But it'll gradually just kind of like disappear in the manner we just mentioned, after being reduced to a pasty, creamy mass by degrees. And that little mouthful of bread will have yielded you about twice as much nourishment as a piece of equal size eaten in the ordinary way, and about 3 times the amount of the food prana. Another interesting example is had in the case of milk. Milk is a fluid and, of course, needs no breaking up as does solid food. Yet the fact remains that a quart of milk simply allowed to flow down the throat yields not over half the nourishment of food prana that is derived from the same quantity of milk sipped slowly and allowed to remain in the mouth a moment until it kind of melts away, the tongue being moved through it. The babe drawing the milk from the nipple of either the breast or the bottle, of course, does so by a sucking motion, which moves the tongue and the cheeks and produces a flow of fluid from the glands, which liberates the food prana and has also a chemical digestive effect upon the milk itself, notwithstanding the fact that true saliva is not secreted in the young babe and doesn't appear until the teeth show themselves. We advise our students to experiment with themselves along the lines just pointed out. Choose an opportunity when you have plenty of time, and then, masticating slowly, allow the food to gradually melt away, instead of making a deliberate attempt to swallow. This melting away of the food can only be possible when the food is masticated into a cream-like paste, thoroughly saturated with saliva, and the particles thereby converted into a semi-digested state, and having had the food prana extracted therefrom. Try eating an apple like this. You'd be surprised at the feeling of having eaten a fair-sized meal, and at the sensation of increased strength, which has come to you from it. We understand fully that it's quite a different thing for the yogi to take his time and eat in this way, and then for the hurried Western man of business to do the same thing. We fully understand this. And we don't expect all of our readers to change the habit of years all at once. But we feel sure that a little practice in this method of eating will cause quite a change to come over one, and we know that such occasional practice will soon result in quite an improvement in the everyday method of masticating the food. And we also know that the student will find a new delight, an additional relish in eating, and will soon learn to eat lovingly. That is, to feel loath to let the mouthful of food pass away. A new world of taste is opened up to the person who learns to follow this plan. And he'll get far more pleasure from eating than ever before. And will have, besides, a much better digestion, much more vitality, and he will obtain a greater degree of nourishment and an increased amount of food prana. It's possible for one who has the time and the opportunity to follow this plan to its extreme limit. to obtain it is possible for one who has the time and opportunity to follow this plan to its extreme limit to obtain an almost unbelievable amount of nourishment and strength from a comparatively small amount of food, as there will be practically no waste, as may be proven by an observation of the waste matter which is passed from the system. Those suffering from malnutrition and impaired vitality will find it profitable to at least partially follow this plan. The yogis are known as small eaters, and yet they understand fully the necessity and value of perfect nutrition, and always keep the body well nourished and provided with building material. The secret, as you will readily see, is that they waste practically none of the nourishment in the food, as they extract practically all that it contains. They don't burden their system with waste material, which clogs up the machinery and causes a waste of energy in order that it may be thrown off. They obtain a maximum of nourishment from a minimum of food, a full supply of food prana from a small amount of material. While you may not be able to follow this matter up to the extreme, you may work a great improvement in yourself by following the methods above given. We merely give you the general principles. Work the rest out for yourself. Experiment for yourself. That's the only way to learn anything anyway. Scratchy throat there. Excuse me. We have stated several times in this book that the mental attitude aids materially in the process of absorbing prana. Well, we didn't read those parts necessarily, but I pointed them out where it seemed like it fit. So whether it came in the words of the book or from my mouth, either way, we have stated several times here that the mental attitude aids materially in the process of absorbing prana. This is true not only of the prana absorbed from the air, but also of the food prana. Hold the thought that you are absorbing all the prana contained in a mouthful of food, combining that thought with that of nourishment, and you will be able to do much more than you can do without so doing. Now, about food itself, we intend to leave the matter of the choice of food an open question. While personally we prefer certain kinds of food, believing that the best results are obtained from the use thereof, we recognize the fact that it's impossible to change the habits of a lifetime, of generations in fact, in a day. And man must be guided by his own experience and his growing knowledge, rather than by dogmatic utterances of others. The yogis prefer a non-animal diet, both from hygienic reasons and the Oriental aversion to eating the flesh of animals. The more advanced of the yogi students prefer a diet of fruit, nuts, olive oil, and so forth, together with a form of unleavened bread made from the entire wheat. But when they travel among those who follow different dietary rules from themselves, they don't hesitate to adapt themselves to the changed conditions to a greater or lesser extent, and they don't render themselves a burden to their hosts, knowing that if they follow the yogi plan of masticating their food slowly, their stomachs will take good care of what they eat. That's fine. In fact, some of the most indigestible things in the modern menu may be safely eaten if the above-mentioned system is adopted. And we write this chapter in the spirit of the traveling yogi. We have no wish to force arbitrary rules upon our students. Man must grow into a more rational method of eating, rather than having it forced upon him suddenly. It's hard for one to adopt a non-meat diet if he has been used to animal flesh all his life, and it's equally difficult for one to take up an uncooked dietary list if he's been eating cooked dishes all his life. Now, all we ask of you is to think a little on the subject and to trust your own instinct regarding the choice of food, giving yourself as great a variety as possible. Now, the instinct, if trusted, will usually cause you to select that which you need for that particular meal. And we would prefer to trust the instinct rather than to bind ourselves to any fixed, unchangeable diet. Eat pretty much what you feel like, providing you masticate it thoroughly and slowly in the manner that we have talked about, with all of its dimensions involved, and give yourself a wide range of choice. We will speak in this chapter of a few things which the rational person will avoid, but we'll do so merely in the way of just general advice. In the matter of non-meat eating, we believe that mankind will gradually grow to feel that meat is not his proper diet. But we believe that one must outgrow that feeling, rather than to have it beaten out of him, for if he longs for the flesh pots of Egypt, it's about as bad as if he really participated in the feast. Man will cease to desire meat as he grows, but until that time comes, any forced restraint of the meat habit won't do him much good. We're aware that this will be considered heterodox by many of our readers, but we can't help that fact. Our statement will stand the test of experience. If our students are interested in the question of the relative advantages of particular kinds of foods, well, then let them read some of the very good works which have been written upon the subject in recent years. Now, this was written, remember, in what, 1914 or 04? But let them read upon the several sides of the question and avoid being carried away by the particular fad of the writer whose book is before them. Now, it's instructive and interesting to read of the comparative food values of the various articles on our tables. And such knowledge will gradually tend toward a more rational diet. But such changes must be the result of thought and experience rather than upon the mere say-so of some person writing a hobby. We suggest that our students consider whether or not they are eating too much meat, whether they are living upon too much fat and grease, whether they are eating enough fruit, whether whole wheat bread would not be a good addition to their bill of fare, and whether they are not indulging in too much pastry and so-called made dishes. If we were asked to give them a general rule regarding eating, we would be apt to say, eat a variety of food, avoid rich dishes, don't eat too much fat, beware of the frying pan, don't eat too much meat, avoid especially the pig and the veal, let your general habit of eating tend toward the simple, plain fare rather than towards the elaborate dishes. Go slow on pastry. Cut out hot cakes from your list. Masticate thoroughly and slowly according to the plan we've given you. And don't be afraid of food. If you eat it properly, it won't hurt you, providing you don't fear it. We think it better to make the first meal of the day a light one, as there is very little waste to repair in the morning, as the body has been at rest all night. If possible, have a little exercise before breakfast. If you once return to the natural habit of proper mastication and experience the sensation that comes from proper eating, the abnormal appetites which have been acquired will fall from you, and the natural hunger will return. When natural hunger is with you, the instinct will be very keen in picking out nutritious food for you, and you will feel inclined toward that which will give you just the nourishment you need at any particular time. So pursue that course of action. Man's instinct is a good guide, providing it hasn't been spoiled by the indulgence in the absurd dishes so common in these days which create false appetite. If you feel out of sorts, don't be afraid to cut out a meal and give the stomach a chance to get rid of what it has on hand. One can go without eating for a number of days without any danger, although we do not advise prolonged fasts. We feel, however, that in sickness it's wise to give the stomach a rest in order that the recuperative energy may be directed toward the casting out of the waste matter which has been causing the trouble. You'll notice that animals stop eating when they're sick and lie around until health is restored, and then they return to their meals. We may take this lesson from them with considerable profit. We don't wish our students to become food cranks who weigh, measure, and analyze every mouthful of food. We consider this to be an abnormal method and believe that such a course generates fear thought and fills the instinctive minds with all sorts of erroneous ideas. We think it is a much better plan to use ordinary precautions and judgment in the selection of one's food and then to bother no more about the matter. But eat with thought of nourishment and strengthen your minds, masticating the food as we have stated, knowing that nature will do its work well. Keep as close to nature as possible, and let her plans be your standard of measurement. The strong, healthy man is not afraid of his food, and neither should be the man who wishes to be healthy. Keep cheerful, breathe properly, eat properly, live properly. And you won't have occasion to make a chemical analysis of every mouthful of food. Don't be afraid to trust your instinct. That is the natural man's guide, after all. And the same goes with water. And I'll just leave it at that about water. Same thing, same process, same way of thinking about it. Food and water, nourishment and vital force. And there we have it.